Weatherwise, July 2024 was a doozy. Record-breaking heat across the U.S., the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record, and 32 tornadoes in a single day near Chicago. All of 2024 was astonishing. As of November 1st, the nation experienced 24 weather and climate disasters, with losses exceeding $1 billion each in damage. You're listening to the Washington State Magazine podcast, stories connecting you to Washington State University, the state, and the world. Josh Ward, field meteorologist for Washington State University's Ag WeatherNet, talks with Washington State Magazine science writer Becky Kramer about the weather extremes in 2024. Ward also looks ahead to 2025 winter weather in the Pacific Northwest.
So, Josh, welcome to the Washington State Magazine podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me, Becky. It's great to be here.
So you're a field meteorologist and you work for Ag WeatherNet. And tell me a little bit about what you do and what Ag WeatherNet is.
Sure, yep. So I'm the one of two field meteorologists here at Ag WeatherNet. And I'm originally from North Carolina, so that's where you see the accent from. I went to school in UNC Asheville, graduated with my undergrad in May in atmospheric science. And my main responsibility is building and maintaining the network that we have of weather stations set up across the state. There's about 300 or so weather stations that we maintain, and we're getting ready to build another 35 coming in the next few years. Here at Ag WeatherNet, we also have a diverse team that they work on model forecasts as well, using all of the data across the station, across the network. And they input this data into their models so that we can get a spring frost forecasting model for the state, which is a service that we provide. And we also have these private stations set up in many of the orchards across the state. And it allows them to monitor heat stress and grape hardiness and things of that nature. And in addition to that, we also have weather stations at cattle yards, so provide the cattle comfort index for cattle feeders across the state. I believe not too long ago, there was a pretty cold snap. So we use the cattle comfort index so the cattle feeders will know when to turn on heaters and things of that nature. So
your background is in atmospheric science, and part of your studies were understanding why we have weather.
Yes. So I have a concentration in climatology, and not a lot of people know this, but the reason that we do have weather is the imbalance of incoming radiation at the equator and the poles.
From the sun?
Yep, from the sun, yep. So all the solar radiation comes in more at the equator than it does at the poles. So you get this really warm air mass at the equator and a really cooler air mass at the poles. The atmosphere's job is to distribute this energy across the globe so that the Earth can reach an equilibrium point. And it does that through mid-latitude cyclones and cold fronts and things of that nature. That's the reason we even have weather.
So in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had quite a few very big and very damaging weather events. And can you talk about why we're seeing an increase?
If we look at the last, 10 to 15 years and the number of billion-dollar events that we've had from the late 20th century all the way up to the present time, we see that the billion-dollar events has doubled in the past 10 to 15 years. And what's going on here is that we have a lot more energy in the atmosphere than we used to. So more energy in the atmosphere requires the atmosphere to distribute it somehow. And it's doing that through these really compact and high energy mesoscale events, such as thunderstorms. So these thunderstorms are actually the most frequent billion-dollar event in the past 10 to 15 years. And that has tripled since the late 20th century, early 2000s. One of the things we can look at here is the 2022 flooding event in Kentucky just absolutely dumped all kinds of water on this area. Rainfall totals were 600% above the normal rate here. And again, it's just so much energy. This convection is so strong that it's just allowing all this water to just be dumped in one area very quickly. Now, it is important to note that with that event, the atmosphere did have somewhat of a perfect setup, but nonetheless, still absolutely devastating. And on the subject of flooding in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a paper written in the late 90s, early 2000s that shows these flash flood events that have increased dramatically since the 60s and 80s. We see many more frequent flash flooding events. And again, it's just these mesoscale thunderstorms that are just dumping so much rain so quickly.
So you talked earlier about just more energy in the atmosphere. Is global warming a contributor to this?
Global warming is a contributor to this. There's no way around it. It's very complex, but we also have more moisture because of this. So sea surface temperatures are rising and we have more abundant moisture. So more moisture means more potential for strong convection. And again, we see these really compact thunderstorms that are developing here in just the past 10 to 15 years. They're so much more damaging than they used to be.
So let's talk about the year in general. What were some of the notable events weather-wise for 2024?
Sure. There was so much that happened this year. I mean, so many records were broken. I have a list here that I like to go through, starting with New Hampshire. New Hampshire saw the warmest July on record so far. There were 5 locations in the West that experienced record high temperatures, starting with Palm Springs, California, at 124 degrees Fahrenheit. Alaska had the wettest July on record. Washington, D.C. tied the record for the most consecutive days of temperatures over 100. Hurricane Beryl became the earliest Category 5 hurricane in history. And a Chicago derecho spawned 32 tornadoes in one day, the most for that area in history. And all of that happened just in July, which is just astonishing. I mean, we're seeing so many records broke just even in the past 2 years. I mean, it's crazy.
What made July the month when all this happened?
Well, July is when we have the most potential for these mesoscale and tropical meteorology events. So this is where you have the greatest temperature gradients because you have the earth is very warm at the bottom and the atmosphere is cooler up top, which enhances the risk of convection and, derechos and things of that nature.
And what are derechos?
Derecho is pretty much a widespread straight line windstorm that can or cannot be associated with thunderstorms. So that is a derecho.
You were telling me what was happening.
Yeah, sure. Well, we can look at the Pacific Northwest actually, if you want to here. So, for an example, from my understanding, I wasn't here in July, but Eastern Washington seemed to be very warm during this month. What happened was I did a little bit of research on this, and the Arctic Oscillation actually played a role here, which is the oscillation that refers to the pressure difference over the poles and the mid-latitudes. And when this index is in a positive state, usually we get these warmer temperatures across the northern part of the country. And we saw that in July here in Eastern Washington, where the index was very positive. So we had the jet stream was much higher than it normally is. And we had all this warm air from the Californias in the West rising up to meet in the Pacific Northwest. So that's what we saw, that the temperature increased there.
Now, July seemed, I don't know, maybe about 10 degrees warmer than usual in Pullman, where I'm based, but August seemed cooler than normal. Was that true, or is that just my perception?
There's a little bit of truth and perception in there. According to the climatology and average temperatures in August here in Eastern Washington, they were actually normal, but I think some of the perception comes in here when you come off of these very extreme temperatures in July. And once you go back to normal, it seems much cooler, but that's not really the case. It's just normal. And what happened here, again, the Arctic Oscillation Index was negative here, so that jet stream was able to dip down a little bit more and provide some cooler air for the state in August.
So what was happening with wildfires last year?
Well, Me being new to the West here, I'm not very familiar with wildfires and things of that nature. When I got here, I was being trained in the field, and we would drive the vehicles out to the stations. And the person training me said, "Don't park the vehicle over tall grass." And I was like, that doesn't, I mean, I've never had an issue with that before. I don't understand. He was like, just the heat from the engine can start a wildfire here in Washington State. And I was like, wow, that's just crazy. But in terms of wildfires across the state in 2024 here in Washington, I pulled up the data for the Chelan station that the Ag WeatherNet has. And I was looking at the past 3 years worth of data, and everything seemed to be the same this year as the previous years up until 2021, even though there were many more wildfires in the previous years. So I think the potential for wildfires here was high. I think what happened, though, was just a very good job with the states handling. There were 1,400 ignitions this year, but 95% of those were 10 acres or less.
Anything else on weather for 2024?
Well, yeah. Let's talk about Hurricane Helene. So we saw these absolutely devastating events happen in Asheville in the Western Carolina and Eastern Tennessee. And the crests for the rivers were a record for 8 locations in Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee. Asheville also broke its 1, 2, and 3-day rainfall records that has previously stood for 100 years with this event. And what's interesting is that there was a predecessor event in the Western North Carolina before this hurricane hit. So it was already wet here. And this really, really enhanced the flooding because the ground was already saturated. So we see the runoff was much larger. It was still a lot of water, whether or not the predecessor event exists. The predecessor event made it even worse than it could have been.
Remind me the time frame for that.
Oh man, this was about 2 weeks after I had left for Washington State. So I had just dodged this. I was just in Asheville in May, and I moved out here in September, and that's when it happened pretty much. So, yep, mid-late September.
Yeah. I've never been in a hurricane, never been near one. We did have a big windstorm. I think it was 2015 in the Spokane area. And they said we had kind of hurricane force winds.
Oh, wow.
But of course, we didn't get the water with it.
Hurricanes they're very alarming, especially your first one. The first hurricane that if you have to go through one, it's very scary. Visibility is low, winds are high, enormous amounts of water, possibility for tornadoes, especially here in the past 5 years. We've just seen a lot of tornadoes coming from hurricanes.
So what's ahead weather-wise for 2025 for the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, so it looks like we're heading into a weak La Niña here upcoming this winter. And that's going to create some interesting patterns here for the Pacific Northwest. My prediction is that we'll see a wetter and cooler than normal winter. And when you look at this, given the Arctic Oscillation, what it's been doing here in the winter months for the past few years, you see that the average index for the Arctic Oscillation is decreasing. So that leads me to believe that there's a strong possibility that we could have a pretty snowy winter here in Eastern Washington, with probably very similar to last year, where we saw these cold snaps, which impacted growers across the state.
Great. So I was going to ask too, can anyone sign up for Ag WeatherNet to get the forecasts from the organization?
Yes, absolutely. You can go to our website at weather.wsu.edu, and you can click the underneath the drop down. You'll see a sign in tab. You can click that, and it will give you an option to register. And you can type in your information, and you'll get the weekly outlook forecast that I do each week for the state of Washington. It'll be a quick summary in your inbox, and then with that will be a link to the full outlook on our webpage.
Josh, it's been great having you on the podcast. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, thank you for having me. And I do have a few closing thoughts, actually. So I come across this yesterday, but NOAA just found that the Arctic is now a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. And this is due to the melting of the ice here, releasing the layer of permafrost in the Arctic, which is contributing to additional carbon in our atmosphere, which is interesting. And we also saw that NOAA reported that fall of 2024 was the warmest on record for the United States. Again, another record broken. I mean, we are in the decade of breaking records for weather, I do believe. Be on the lookout for that in the future.
Thank you. So great to meet you, and welcome to the Northwest.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you as well.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to sign up for Ag WeatherNet updates, the link is in the show notes. You could find more podcasts and WSU stories at magazine.wsu.edu. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. The episode was produced by Becky Kramer and Larry Clark. Our music is by WSU Emeritus Music Professor and Composer Greg Yazanitsky.